That's all for today's Nintendo Direct. Thank you for watching.
What, no Bayonetta 4?
Cereza and the Lost Demon.
Hey everyone, today I want to talk about the prequel to the first Bayonetta game, Bayonetta Origins, Cereza and the Lost Demon, specifically the Faeries of the Avalon Forest. In Cereza and the Lost Demon, we follow an older Cereza or younger Bayonetta living away from the clan under the teachings of exiled Umber Witch, Morgana, on the outskirts of the Avalon Forest. She attempts to summon a demon, but because of her hesitation, the demon vanishes into ash. Disappointed in her fear, Morgana chides Cereza for being afraid of the demon she failed to control and walks away. After feeling like Morgana never gave her any appreciation, combined with the memory of a dream she had earlier, Cereza ventures into the Avalon Forest to retrieve a magic power so she could save her mother. After entering, Cereza then gets attacked by some fairies, so she attempts to summon the demon again. She succeeds this time, but not in the way she thought, as the demon ends up inside of her doll Cheshire, using it as a conduit, instead of using her hair as one. After some world building, the unlikely pair of Cereza and Cheshire set off on their journey to achieve their goals. One to return to Inferno, and the other to find the power to save her mother. Let's begin our own journey as we talk about the fairy enemies they encounter. Starting with the pawns, the rankings of fairies follow chess naming conventions with titles and groups matching those of chess pieces. Anyway, like the third sphere of the hierarchy of Laguna, the pawns represent the lowest rank of fairies. Let's go down the list now. The Denizen of the Wood. Aos Sí is one of the first fairies we see. It wields a long blade, but it isn't really that much of a threat. Basically, it can be compared to Affinity in terms of where it stands within its ranking and difficulty. Its description goes: the most commonly seen quadruped fairy of Avalon. They are known to be slightly moody, but universally love to play tricks. Souls are their main source of sustenance, and they usually live off the negative vibes acquired from tormenting humans and wisps. They also vary in size. Aos Sí, who have lived for longer periods, tend to be larger and significantly more dangerous. Among fairies, they are an inferior breed with no special abilities to speak of, but their basic physical strength still averages with that of an adult human. As they can use both weapons and magic, they can pose a significant threat in their own right. That being said, most have a poor sense of sight, hearing, and smell, and can thus usually be avoided by simply hiding. They are usually tasked with minor guard duty, instructed to report anything suspicious to their commanding fairy officers. Being discovered by one could quickly result in a whole fairy army coming to their aid, so it is usually best to avoid confrontation when unnecessary. Aos Sí comes from Celtic mythology. It is the name of a supernatural race that is comparable to fairies or elves. The name Aos Sí means people of the fairy mounds, with the word Sí coming from Sí, which means otherworldly mounds or hills. These mounds refer to the hills of Ireland, where they were said to inhabit. At some time later, some English texts use the word Sí to refer to both the fairy mounds and the people that resided there interchangeably, which is incorrect. An example of this would be when W.B. Yeats in 1908 referred to the Aos Sí as the Sí. Just like the fairies in the game, the Aos Sí were fierce defenders of their homes, and intruding on their spaces would cause them to remove the unwanted guest. Like the other fairies, they live off the negative vibes from humans and wisps. Wisps are the souls of humans who died in the Avalon Forest after being lost. The Haphazard Shooter. Bogie is a fairy that wields a cannon on its arm. Another one of the grunt-like fairies that spawns pretty often as more of a distraction or a disruptor. The cannon has a visible line of sight that acts as a way to scatter you or at least have you move out of the way. Its description goes: a quadruped fairy wielding a cannon created with Avalonian weaponsmithing. Desperate for any opportunity to open fire, and usually will do so the instant an enemy is spotted. The cannon has poor accuracy and bogies have terrible aim, but the ammunition it uses can be quite damaging in the off chance it hits. As the shots themselves are not particularly fast, they can be safely avoided if one watches the trajectory closely. Bogie are primarily tasked to find humans and lure them to larger groups of fairies. To accomplish this, they station themselves in one spot, waiting for passers-by. Of course, they're not good at waiting and usually start blasting away for some reason before long enough. The ammunition they use is relatively simple to make, so they essentially never run out. If spotted, it's advantageous to take them out of the picture early. The name Bogie is another name for the boogeyman, a popular fairy-like creature used to scare children into behaving. There is no concrete depiction of it, as the way the creature is viewed differs between cultures, but they all fulfill similar purposes. The word boogeyman linguistically is related to the word boggart, as they both come from the Middle English word bogie, which means terror. A boggart is any evil or mischievous spirit or apparition. Like a boogeyman, boggarts don't have one uniform depiction of what it is, and rather is more of a category than an individual being. A boogeyman could be a boggart, really. Its name could also refer to Humphrey Bogart, also known as Bogie, who was one of the original founders and leader of the Rat Pack, who was succeeded by Frank Sinatra after he died. If anything, the spelling would just be a nice nod, since Frank Sinatra does sing the closing credits cover of Moonlit Serenade in Bayonetta 3. The Devious Trapper. Leipreachán is another disruptor type of fairy. It lays traps along the battle, which will force you to either trigger it or avoid it. The traps can also be found around Avalon Forest, with sweets over it. Its description goes, a shrewd fairy excelling at planting traps around Avalon to snatch up the unsuspecting. Most are well versed in the forest's byways, knowing just the inconspicuous spots to set a trap for maximum effect. A true nuisance of a fairy. Likely due to the fact that their principal targets are humans and wisps, they often will place jewels or other shiny objects near their traps as bait. Some are even cunning enough to make their own treasure chest and then booby-trap the area around it. Those unknowing of these admonishable habits think of the Leipreachán as a safekeeper of treasure, and believe them to know where buried gold and other treasures may be hidden. The traps they make are built using wood straight from the forest, meaning there is no shortage of materials. This has made it possible for the Leipreachans to build an absurd amount of traps in the forest. Some wild fairies of the forest have even taken to copying Leipreachans in recent years, leaving traps in all sorts of strange places. The spelling of Leipreachán is how it is generally spelled in Ireland, aside from some regional differences. Leprechauns are said to be solitary fairies who primarily make shoes and enjoy practical jokes. There is also a legend that leprechauns hide a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, similarly to how the description references that leprechauns are safekeepers of treasure in the eyes of people. Leprechauns are one of the more popular fairies that exist as household names, at least in American culture, no doubt due to the popularity of their use as mascots. The Stern Defender. Spriggan is a fairy with a giant shield with a gold handle on top, so you can use the wood elemental core power to pluck it and knock it back at it. It is meant to be a defender, but really it only defends itself since it keeps the shield in front of it alone. Its description goes, a quadruped fairy that uses a large shield to protect itself and other fairies from enemy attacks. Receiving formal training from its biped seniors, it is capable of fending off most attacks from the front. Unfortunately, just managing that requires most of its concentration, which also means it is rarely successful in being of any help to its allies. It also seems so fixated on protecting itself that it forgets to attack. Spriggan's shields were forged from adamant ore during Avalon's feudal period. The shields are maintained by the Spriggans collectively and kept in near flawless condition. If any are ever lost, it is considered the group's responsibility. The curly tip design at the shield's top often snags on things in the forest, and most Spriggans wish it could be removed. Spriggans are legendary creatures that come from Cornish mythology. The name Spriggan comes from the Cornish plural spirisan, which means spirits or fairies. They are often depicted as grotesque old men with childlike heads. They resided in old ruins guarding buried treasure, and while small, they were also considered the ghosts of giants and retained their former strength. They were notorious for creating whirlwinds to scare people and storms to destroy crops. They would even steal children. There's a story called The Old Woman Who Turned Her Shift, where an old woman outsmarted a group of Spriggans to get their loot by turning her clothes inside out, which is a supposed method of keeping fairies away, like iron or holy water. Adamant, the material the Spriggans' shields are made from, is a legendary material with different qualities given to it over time, such as being as hard as steel or having the power to block magnets. Nowadays, adamant is only really used for anachronistic or fictional use, like in literature or video games. The Wandering Sharpshooter. Pixie is basically the decorations or the fury of the fairies, a small flying nuisance that shoots stuff from the sky. You can use the wood core power to knock it to the ground where Cereza can thornbind it so you can finish it off. Overall, not really a threat, it's just annoying. Its description goes: a fairy that randomly formed large wings that allow it to fly freely in the sky. Normally they spend their time patrolling Avalon from the skies, swooping down to alert the other fairies of anything suspicious they may come across. Their wings also prove useful for carrying supplies to different parts of the forest. As fighters, they are fairly strong, picking out unsuspecting prey from the sky with the cannon latched on them. Still, as if in exchange for their wings, their bodies are frail and most can be knocked out of the air with a single well-placed hit. What causes these sudden wing growths in fairies have been researched, but no conclusive evidence has been discovered. As such, most attempts to create more pixies are done through mere guesswork, and few have been successful so far, making pixies relatively rare. Pixies are mythical beings from British folklore. The name Pixie has disputed origins and it is unknown exactly where it comes from. One of the proposed origins of the word is a Swedish dialectal piske, which means small fairy, but the reason this is disputed is because there is no plausible case for Nordic dialectal records in southwest Britain. They are usually depicted as small creatures with pointy ears that wear rags. Pixies are probably the creature I've seen depicted more often in my life outside of fairies and leprechauns, though interpretations are loose from their actual origins. The Fledgling Mage. Gean Cánach is a cute fairy with a wizard hat. While not very resilient, it can summon powerful lightning strikes that can be really annoying to deal with when in a larger group of enemies and your attention is divided. Its description goes: a quadruped fairy wizard with a pointy hat. While still being a lesser fairy, they have acquired a few useful spells, including teleportation and duplication. Their offensive arsenal may not be as powerful as that of higher ranking fairies, but it generally serves its purposes. Their trademark in combat is to trap their enemy and make them suffer slowly. To their opponent's advantage, they're not especially quick spellcasters. They are quite studious and learn most fairy magic fundamentals under biped wizard fairies known as Sparcanagh, but they are always seeking out additional knowledge, sometimes going as far as to dig through the forgotten belongings of humans who disappeared here. Their triangle hat is said to be them mimicking human culture in a show of respect for the greater wizards of legend. On a strange side note, they cast their spells in a low, soft voice that has been likened to whispering sweet nothings to an admirer. Gean Cánach is the Irish way of spelling Gean Cánach, a male fairy that seduces women. The Irish spelling of Gean Cánach translates to love talker. This fairy is often confused with a similar sexual creature known as an incubus. A Gean Cánach is a sinister fairy who seduces women by being very attractive and charismatic. Once a woman touches him physically, she immediately becomes obsessed with him and is essentially his slave. The fairy will then continue on with life, boasting with men about his conquests, and encourages other men to do the same. Meanwhile, the woman is absolutely obsessed to the point of insanity. Once the fairy is bored, he will disappear, leaving the woman obsessed where she keeps looking for him, ignoring sleep, hunger, and other self-preservation, until she dies of a broken heart. The description references this in a kid-friendly way by liking the way the Gean Cánach cast their spells to sweet nothings. The Excavation Engineer. Knocker is a fairy with a drill on its head. It is kinda like an underground version of Pixie. Knocker uses the drill on its head to burrow underground to attack from below. You can use the stone core power to unbury it and leave it vulnerable to attack or a thorn bind. Its description goes: a quadruped fairy that dons a unique spiraling helmet. Knockers use this helmet like a drill and spin their bodies to burrow into the ground. The helmet is made more than durable enough to withstand this. This technique is primarily used to dig underground tunnels for transporting energy, but when in battle, knockers can use it to spring up from under their opponent with a shockingly powerful attack. The offensive ability of this assault makes them an enemy to be feared. Since they spend most of their day burrowed in the ground, they have even worse eyesight than that of a typical fairy. They also seem to be weak to sunlight, and as so, do not like to be above ground for longer than necessary. Because of this, there are actually fairies who don't even know knockers exist. Their constant burrowing has led them to discover many locations of hidden jewels and beds of ore. Sadly, they aren't the most generous fairies and tend to keep this information a secret from anyone, other fairies included. A knocker comes from Cornish and Devon folklore. It is a gnome-like creature usually grouped with fairies and sprites. It can also be known as a knacker, or in the United States as a Tommy knocker. They are related to the Irish leprechauns. Knockers are generally considered to be benevolent creatures and more mischievous than malicious. They would do things like hide tools and blow out candles. Knockers were also helpful, signaling miners to find veins of tin in the mines and signaling when mine walls were expected to collapse. In return, miners would toss their last bit of their pasties for them as a show of appreciation. There are interpretations that knockers are actually ghosts of the dead that perished in the mines. Their subterranean living is referenced in the description, where it says they spend so much time down there that fairies don't even know if they exist. The Elite Warrior. Dvergr is a tougher fairy because of its armor and mace, so it takes longer to defeat, but it doesn't feel much stronger. This is probably just because it's literally just an armored Ishi wielding a mace instead of a blade. Its description goes: a quadruped fairy with a clunky helmet covering most of their head. Originally Ishi, their helmets are received from higher ranking officers when promoted. Their control of their abilities surpasses those of normal quadrupeds, and they have trained tirelessly to build an indomitable fortitude. Undoubtedly the strongest of all the quadruped fairies, they may possibly hold their own with some of the bipeds. This is all greatly diminished by the fact their helmet is so big and heavy they can barely see anything. Still, to a Dvergr, their helmet is their greatest source of pride. Though they take care of it with great dedication, its overall craftsmanship is substandard, and it breaks easily upon impact. For this reason, many Dvergr learn how to forge and repair armor, and by result of this, assist in the maintenance of other fairies' armor as well. Some Dvergr have even gone so far as to retire from the battlefield completely and hammer away all day in their smithy to provide adequate weaponry for all fairy kind. Dvergr is a cognate of the word dwarf, and it comes from Old Norse mythology. Based on their description, the Dvergr may be based on the attribution of dwarves being master craftsmen, creating prominent magical treasures in Norse mythology such as Thor's hammer Mjolnir or Odin's spear Gungnir. Being based on Norse mythology is fitting since Bayonetta borrows a lot from it throughout the series with terms like Ginnungagap, Aesir, Vigrid, etc. The Mischievous Firestarter. Salamander looks like someone gave Ishi a flaming staff and told it to run wild with it. They can create flames on the floor of the battlefield by wielding their staff. Its description goes: a fairy wizard with a flaming staff. Though a wizard by name, they are limited to using flame magic. Still, the flame magic of fairies can be quite powerful, and Salamander are able to create raging flames that can grow many times larger than their tiny stature. While other fairies typically would value their assistance on the sidelines, sometimes their spells slip out of their control and fry their allies. Though flame magic is something that has existed among the fairies for ages, each fairy's aptitude is decided for the most part at birth and can range drastically. Salamanders display more natural talent than other fairies, and they show a fair bit of pride regarding this. Salamanders sometimes will sneak into human villages to play tricks by setting things on fire, so they are typically associated with fire to humans as well. Only, as fairies are not known to use flame magic, they are simply considered to be fairies drawn to the flame. I have mentioned this before in my second Bayonetta weapons video when talking about Salamander and Undyne, but salamanders are associated with fire. This association comes from the writings of Paracelsus, who believed the elements inhabited different spirits. The four spirits being sylphs for air, gnomes for earth, undynes for water, and salamanders for fire. Unless I'm misinterpreting the description, it seems that in-universe humans see these fairies as admirers of the flame, and not the cause, which doesn't really make any sense because they're holding flaming staffs, but, yeah, okay. They just happen to be nearby the fires, which is like how real-life salamanders were thought to just appear around fire. Salamanders hibernate in or under rotting logs, so when those logs were set aflame in a fireplace, for example, the salamanders would appear from the fire, most likely causing the association. These last two fairies have no rank, but I feel they should just be touched on before the higher ranks. The Revenant Fairy. Barghest is a ghostly-looking fairy that is summoned in numbers by fauns to attack on its behalf. Unlike other fairies, it technically isn't one. Barghest are the spirits of dead fairies. They manifest after death, and since they don't produce negative vibes when tormented like wisps do, they are mostly left alone outside of Faun giving them a physical form to be meat shields. Its description goes, a fairy spirit summoned by fauns. They tend to have a fairer complexion than flesh and blood fairies and the trademark of being faintly transparent. Though a spirit, the faun's magic gives them a corporeal form in this world. Fauns largely summon Barghest for this reason, so they can be a physical shield whenever harm comes a faun's way. Having no will of their own, the Barghest have no choice but to be used as their faun master sees fit. Reborn as a spirit after dying in Avalon, they could be said to be for fairies what wisps are to humans. The fairies have no culture of showing respect to their dead, so they are not honored. After some research, they seem unable to release negative vibes no matter how much they are tormented, so most fairies find little use for them. There are instances of some simply appearing out of thin air, wandering the forest aimlessly, but they are rarely tied to the earthly world for too long. The word Barghest comes from how ghost in northern England was pronounced like guest, and the original form is thought to be Barghest, a combination of bur, which means town, and guest. So together it would be town ghost. A Barghest is a mythical black dog, which are creatures that are often connected to the devil or even an omen of death. The Barghest in the game likely draws inspiration from the other use of its name, which refers to a ghost or household elf. It is the only one of these fairies that doesn't have a title card, as they are summoned right when a faun gets its title card. The Arsenal of Doom. Banchine Model P is just a bomb with legs made by the fairies. We first see it being summoned by a Gean Cánach. Probably goes without saying that it and Barghest don't have a rank since they aren't true fairies. Its description goes, a rudimentary machine created by the fairies with the supposed purpose of scaring intruders. Simply put, it's a walking bomb. It contains enough explosives to clear away a large chunk of debris, so it's probably a good deal too strong for just intimidation tactics. If you walk into one, you're probably dead, but that's a design flaw that doesn't particularly bother the fairies. The bombs are built using pomegranates from the forest with a dash more firepower applied through fairy magic. Many fairies comment the noise it makes upon detonation sounds like a loud banshee-esque scream, which they took into consideration when deciding its name. While able to move around by itself to some extent, in order to prevent any disastrous false detonations, it requires to be given an objective before it is armed. This configuration needs to, however, be done by a fairy, and the slightest impact after its completion will result in immediate detonation, making this job rather unpopular among fairies. Probably the most original creative name used here, let's try to dissect it. Banshine is a portmanteau of banshee and machine. Even without looking at the description, this is fairly obvious. A banshee, or in modern Irish, banshee, is a female spirit who heralds the death of a family member. It does this by screaming or keening. The name Banshee is related to the Ishi I mentioned earlier, as the name translates to Woman of the Fairy Mound or Fairy Woman. The keening I mentioned earlier is a traditional vocal lament for the dead in Gaelic Celtic tradition, and up to the 18th century was an integral part of Irish funeral rituals. Model P can mean a variety of different things. It could be a reference to the self-proclaimed king of fairies Púca. It could also reference Platinum Games, which is often stylized as a single P with a 4-point star, which are found on top of the fuse and along the body. The Knight's rank for the fairies are comparable to the second and first sphere of angels. All the fairies in this rank have titles that connect them to gemstones. The only thing is that they are divided within their own ranks, and the only gemstone to be shared is topaz. The Stalwart Guardian and a Jade Knight. Fomhórach acts as the boss guarding the wood elemental core. It is basically an upgraded Spriggan, but this time it can actually hold both a shield and spear at once. Its description goes, an elite biped fairy that uses a large spear in their right hand and sturdy shield their left. Skilled in reading an enemy's movement, they have won their way through many battles by blocking an incoming attack, making an opening, and answering with a swift jab of their spear. Because of their emphasis on defense, they are often called gatekeepers by other fairies, which is also likely related to why many of them are assigned guard duty around fairy fortresses. Their shield is forged with a precious metal called orichalcum and greatly surpasses the defensive abilities of shields used by common fairies. Due to this metal's scarcity, not many of these shields exist, making Fomhórach themselves quite rare. Most Fomhórach are veteran fighters who have been around since Avalon's feudal era. Another reason for being called gatekeepers likely comes from their dedication to law and servitude. They show no hesitation to strike down swift justice on any resident of Avalon causing disorder, even if it were a fellow fairy. The name Fomhórach is a singular way of spelling it in modern Irish. In English, they are called the Fomhórians. Early depictions of them were as creatures from under the sea or the earth, but they were later depicted as giants or sea raiders. They are the enemies of the first settlers of Ireland, as well as the opponents of the Tuatha Dé Danann, which in later folklore are known as the Aos Sí. It's kinda funny how this game makes the Aos Sí as the weakest of the fairies and the Fomhórach as one of the strongest. Interestingly, instead of adamant like Spriggan's shield, Fomhórach's shield is made from orichalcum, a metal that was used to name pure copper or certain alloys of bronze. Its name comes from the Greek word orichalkos, which literally translates to mountain copper or brass. The Speared Hunter and the Tourmaline Knight. Bánánach is a much stronger version of Aos Sí. It is bigger and has a larger weapon, like how a plod compares to affinity. Its description goes: a biped fairy that uses a spear its own height. Developing from quadrupeds after absorbing sufficient energy, they are seated relatively high along the fairy hierarchy. Often are placed within units of lower ranking fairies to step in when needed. Bánánachs possess significant strength which they display through powerful jabs to keep their proximity in check. The wings on their back enable flight, and switching their strategies to a succession of aerial strikes is not uncommon. Aggressive by nature, once they have initiated their attack, they will not cease assault on a target until it has been completely incapacitated, lunging their massive bodies at their opponent to physically overwhelm them. The persistence with which they go after their opponent has likened them to an enraged demon among the other fairies, and yet they also seem to have a strong sense of pride, insisting on fighting their enemies head-on. A Bánánach is a supernatural being, and they were described as specters that haunted battlefields. Similar to banshees, they were also said to shriek. Something else I found was that they were depicted as a white female wraith, who enjoyed the battles that were happening and would fly around the ongoing fight. This is possibly referenced in the description where it says Bánánach has wings to fly over the battlefield and strike their opponents. The Apprentice Clown and an Amber Knight. Amadán is a particularly mischievous yet ruthless fairy that is part of a circus troupe. They torture wisps for their negative energy and enslave them so they can make their suffering an art. Its description goes: a mischievous clown in training. They belong to the Amadán circus troupe where they used to learn under Amádán Dubh until he lost his mind. Since then, they have taken over his work as general overseer of Fairyland Tower, where they are in charge of collecting negative vibes via wisp torment. While still learning to be a clown, they have displayed expert skill in turning wisp torment into a performance art and accumulated a great amount of negative vibes due to it. Though relatively weak for a fairy, they are devious schemers, always thinking of new tricks to try, each one almost unanimously translatable to an effective method of wisp torment. Using the wisp energy they have collected, they have learned how to create barriers for themselves, but overall they're not very threatening in battle. In Irish, Amadán means a fool. Based on appearance, they were most likely based on jesters or royal fools. They specialized in entertainment for the royal court and performed varieties of different talents from music to acting to physical comedy. This is further connected to in the description where Amadán has been able to turn wisp torture into entertainment as a fool is meant to do. It is also revealed in the game that Amadán can transform the fairies, at least Aos Sí, into the illusion fairies that appear out of nowhere throughout the game. The Fairy Knight and one of the Topaz Knights. Gog-Magog is a large armored fairy similar to how Dvergr is armored. It could probably be compared to Ardor. It wields a long mace and its armor falls off as you fight it. Its description goes: a high-ranking fairy commander suited in bulky armor and brandishing a giant mace. To Gog-Magog, nothing would be worth the cost of jeopardizing the battle. When needed, they will throw themselves to the front lines, overpowering their opponent with their incredible might. Taking pride in their heritage, Gog-Magog use arms that have been passed down from a long line of ancestors. According to fairy tradition, the only way a fairy other than a Gog-Magog would ever be allowed use of their weapons and armor would be if an extremely decorated soldier challenged one to a duel and came out victorious. By far the most skilled fighters of the biped fairies, they avoid all-out offenses, favoring to adapt their strategy as required. Between their impenetrable armor and calculated, devastating blows, they are truly a force to be reckoned with. It is said that simply the glaring eyes protruding from deep within their helmet can send such pure dread in an opponent to induce surrender immediately. At first I thought that Gog-Magog came from a pair of names found in the Bible and Quran that have been assigned to individuals, groups, or lands over time. However, it is far more likely to be based on Gog-Magog, a legendary giant in Welsh mythology. An author named Peter Roberts argued that Gog-Magog is a corruption of Caer Madog, which would mean the giant Madog. Either way, he was one of the last of the giants of the island of Albion and led an attack on a Trojan settlement. Later, he was slain by a man named Corineus, being led by Brutus of Troy. Gog-Magog was captured so he could wrestle Corineus. Gog-Magog breaks 3 of his ribs, which enrages Corineus so much that he lifts the giant and throws him off of a cliff. The Deadly Watcher and an Amethyst Knight. Faun is a summoner fairy with a staff that can be used to summon and control Barghests. It was also shown to cause illusions that were manifestations of Cereza's self-doubt. Its description goes, a biped fairy wizard that summons spirits known as Barghest to do its bidding in battle. Able to summon large numbers of spirits simultaneously, they are often likened to a shepherd with a herd of sheep on the battlefield. When fighting, they make a point of staying out of the action, providing assistance through their summons. Their offensive strategies consist of summoning enough Barghest to overwhelm their opponent, and if ever finding themselves in danger, they can easily recall any of their Barghest to act as a shield. Different from the relationship between infernal demons and the Umbra, which is based on a pact, the Faun manipulate their summons through mind control. This means those particularly gifted in mind manipulation learn to control much more than just Barghest. Legend even has it that a small town almost disappeared overnight after a Faun assumed control of the town's youth. Before they were seen as the same as Greek satyrs, Roman Fauns were first seen as ghosts of their chief, the rustic god of the forest, Faunus. They were depicted as naked men and later half-man, half-goat beings who caused fear in men traveling in lonely, wild, or far places. Faun being able to control the minds of others is a scary thought. It has the potential to lead humans to Avalon where they can become wisps and then be used for the negative vibes. The Heated Berserker and the Other Topaz Knight. Mulciber is a strong fairy that can act as a powerful fighter and useful utility unit for its fellow fairies. It is a strong attacker, and giving its allies and itself barriers makes it a good first target. Its description goes, a biped spell knight with a gift for flame and stone magic. Skilled in both physical attacks and magic, Mulciber usually fight in a style that utilizes both. Their proficiency with defensive stone spells allows them to cast barriers on fellow fairy fighters, and their flame magic is said to be able to reach extreme temperatures. Those who anger Mulciber are often suddenly reduced to ash. Using magic fueled by negative vibes, burns induced by Mulciber take much longer to recover. Always seeking ways to strengthen their firepower, they hunt for negative vibes even more aggressively than regular fairies. To fairies, the power of flame magic can be so intense that it eventually consumes one's soul entirely, resulting in a complete loss of sanity. Mulciber are no exception in this matter, with many of them displaying questionable levels of mental stability. On the battlefield, they simply go berserk, becoming unstoppable until they burn out of energy completely. The name Mulciber is another name for Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and the forge. Pretty cut and dry one there. In a way to connect stone and fire, the name Mulciber was also used for an extinct volcano in the North Sea. A little random fact is that in the epic poem Paradise Lost written by John Milton, the capital of hell, Pandemonium, was designed by an architect named Mulciber, who used to construct palaces in heaven before his fall. The Wicked Wizard and a Spinel Knight. Sparcanagh is a strong magic caster, being able to summon powerful lightning strikes. They can strike in lines across the floor or in focus blasts. Its description goes, a biped fairy wizard with excellent knowledge of and proficiency in fairy magic. Many of Avalon's most powerful spellcasters are Sparcanagh. Their preferred way of fighting is to come at an opponent with an onslaught of spells, not giving them even the smallest of openings to respond. With negative vibes being the source of their magic power, the more they intimidate or scare an opponent, the more powerful their spells become. Naturally curious, they spend most of their days exploring the forest for ancient writings, hoping to learn about new spells or enhancements. And while most of their spells have practical application, some they discover turn out to be mostly useless. Always anxious to try their new magic out, their fellow fairies stand the risk of being debilitated by a spell the Sparcanagh don't yet understand. I know I earlier said that Banchine Model P was the most creative name, but this one is more inventive than that. Sparcanagh is not based on anything really, at least nothing in real life. However, because of their appearance being similar to that of Gean Cánach, as well as the name, we can assume that they are meant to be upgrades of them. Like I mentioned before, the name Gean Cánach means love talker, so the name Sparcanagh must mean something talker. However, there is no word that spar translates to from Irish to English. It sounds similar to the word spare, which means sky. This makes sense a bit since lightning comes from the sky, so it can mean sky talker. For the rest of the fairies, while they have ranks, they're all unique to them and they don't share it with anyone. However, something they do have in common is that they're all bosses. The Cold Assailant and the Sapphire Bishop. Murúch skates across the battlefield delivering ice attacks, which threw me off the first time since it has a water theme with its mermaid tail head with tail fin in the shape of a trident. It didn't really make sense to me until I remembered the fire elemental core we had. Its description goes, a fairy so rare that only a handful are said to exist in Avalon. From birth, they possess physical strength and magic ability far greater than that of other bipeds, and as such have the reputation of a one-fairy army. Due to their incredible skill, many have appeared beside the royalty of past fairy dynasties, and fairies would often rumor that allying with a Murúch was the easiest way to becoming the next fairy king. Out of their magic abilities, they seem to prefer ice and are able to use it to adapt to any situation, to long-distance ice blasts to propelling themselves with ice to charge at the enemy. The earth-shattering power of their every attack is so incredible that it is advised to never attempt to face them head-on. Many Murúch are seated in influential roles in the fairy kingdom and possess considerable authority. If ever an enemy appears that proves too much for any of their subordinates, Murúch will step in to deal swift justice. The word Murúch is Irish for marrow, which is a mermaid or merman from Irish folklore. Marrows are like common mermaids, beautiful women with fishtails. They have green hair and green scales. They also have webbing between their fingers. Since marrow typically means sea maiden, using it to refer to males is a default as there's no masculine version of the word. Merman can be translated to Murúch or Fomhórach. The Lunatic Wisp Juggler and the Amber Jester. Amádán Dubh is a massive quadruped fairy, which is pretty rare for the higher ranks, and he's the ringleader that specializes in torturing wisps. Fighting under his big top makes you vulnerable to his cannons and techniques. His description goes, ringleader of the Avalon Circus, Amadán's big top. A true master showman with impeccable talent to dazzle a crowd. Amádán Dubh was once well known across Avalon for his many daring circus acts centered around stage wisps, including the Great Wisp Cannonball where they pack 10 wisps into a circus cannon. To Dubh, nothing is more satisfying than terrifying a poor wisp. He spends most of his days trying to devise his next devious wisp torment. Some time ago, the circus boasted a decent troupe and were without a doubt the most popular attraction in Avalon. Dubh was happy with his success and had personal hopes to make his circus bigger and better, but eventually he became so fixated on endlessly perfecting his shows of terror that he eventually lost sight of all else, and his sanity slipped away permanently. The door to his circus has since been closed, and he stays locked in all day doing shows for no one other than himself. In the beginning, he was a fairy with a quite common small stature who just happened to be the first in the forest to study circus performance when it came to Avalon. In his early studies, he focused on basic performance art but gradually shifted to more wisp-based acts, which quickly became a huge sensation. This surge to fame resulted in mass wisp suffering, creating an excess of negative vibes that he absorbed to become his wobbly clown self now. His intuitive skills for maximizing the output of negative vibes through his circus wisp acts caught the attention of Púca, who praised his work and invited him to his elite council. This led to Dugh's time as the general overseer of Fairyland Tower, where he was further recognized by Púca for reforming his circus tent to double as a source of protection of the Stone Shrine. A record still exists from this era of Dubh requesting increased support and advertising of his circus in repayment for his good work. The Amádán Dubh comes from Irish folklore and means the Black Fool. He is a trickster fairy said to bring madness and oblivion. On dark nights, he plays reed pipes to call the unlucky to him. If you were unfortunate enough to be touched by the fairy, you'd be paralyzed in one or all parts of your body. Like I mentioned previously, this game has most enemies represented in ranks of chess pieces, either directly stated or indirectly implied. The pawns and the knights have their groups. We also have a bishop, rook, king, and queen. However, a jester isn't a normal chess piece, but it is a fairy chess piece. In the fairy chess game known as fairy chess, the jester piece moves like a normal queen moves, but cannot capture or be captured. The Voracious Fairy Dragon and the Emerald Rook, revoked. The Jabberwock is a giant draconic fairy that is not really loyal to the kingdom of Avalon. He is not a mindless beast, yet he can be vicious in how he acts. He is extremely resilient thanks to his wings and scales, can spew flames, and attack with his tail. His description goes: a gigantic dragon fairy usually found near Wyvern Falls. He considers anything other than himself food, even munching down other fairies when so inclined. He spends most of his day hunting for meals, most likely in order to maintain his sizable figure. All of Avalon is overcome by an intense dread just hearing the flap of his wings, as he takes off to survey from the sky. He partakes in many exotic foods, especially pomegranates, the explosive fruit of a flower originally found in Inferno. If spotting any mid-flight, he will dive down to gobble up a mouthful immediately. His body is covered in durable scales, said to be stronger than even metal. In the past, other fairies have made many attempts to slay him, but failing to penetrate his hardened exterior, they instead inevitably become the Jabberwock's lunch. There is little more terrifying a sound than his thundering screech, which itself alone causes shockwaves powerful enough to rip apart your insides. Despite his seemingly savage instincts, he possesses an intelligence on par with most of the other fairies in Avalon, and is known to form alliances when determined self-beneficial. There was a time he offered his powers of destruction to the fairy king Mulciber, but was eventually thwarted and sealed away by his successor Arthur. Later, this seal would be removed by the self-proclaimed king Púca, with whom another brief alliance was formed, only for the Jabberwock to ignore most of Púca's orders and run amok in Avalon until Púca was forced to throw him into a cage near Wyvern Falls. It was not long, however, until the Jabberwock had escaped the cage and was again ravaging the forest. Ultimately, no one was truly able to contain the beast until he finally met his demise. Not really relevant, but something about the Jabberwock reminds me of Ridley from Metroid. He's also a smart yet savage draconic enemy, so maybe that's it. The name Jabberwock comes from the nonsense poem Jabberwocky written by Lewis Carroll, included in his 1871 novel Through the Looking Glass, which is the sequel to the 1865 novel Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The creature is often depicted as a dragon. The word Jabberwock is meant to be a combination of the words walker, which means offspring or fruit, and jabber, which means excited talking. Together, this would mean that the Jabberwock is the result of excited discussion. That's what Lewis Carroll essentially said when he was asked by a class from the girls' Latin school, now known as the Boston Latin Academy, if they could use the name The Jabberwock as their school's magazine's name. The Self-Proclaimed King. Púca is a scheming and cunning fairy, but acts like a sort of comic relief character as well. We think he's a tall and regal threat when we first see him, but he's actually just a small pompous fairy. Like a true king, he thinks highly of himself and would like to conquer the 3 realms of the universe. You know, as all kings do. He uses all his power to summon a true threat, or rather a constructive one, an affinity from Paradiso to fight his battles while he sits back on his throne. Ultimately, not a real threat to a current-day Bayonetta, given that Morgana snuffs his life out like nothing. His description goes: an unsettling figure who surfaces from the shadows then dissolves within them just as quickly. He can command many of the fairies of Avalon and seems to have interest in Cereza and Cheshire's whereabouts. His name is Púca, and he claims himself to be the king of the fairy kingdom. He is bent on complete domination of Avalon and commands an army of fairies in order to accomplish this. Being neurotically cautious, he orders lower fairies to constantly patrol the forest for any invaders and extinguish them upon sight, no matter how helpless or innocent they may be. He dons a cape several times taller than his own height and acts overly haughty to anyone in his presence, albeit with a peculiar way of speaking. Not one to fight his own battles, he prefers instead to create strategies for how to eliminate his opposition. A talented user of fairy magic, he has succeeded in creating an illusion of the angel affinity that he can control to his own will. His power should not be underestimated. Originally a researcher serving under the former fairy king, Púca deciphered many human writings and, in turn, was able to create numerous inventions for the kingdom. He showed the talent of a brilliant scientist. The elemental cores also happened to be of Púca's design, and their introduction into fairy society changed it radically. He was praised for his contributions to the kingdom, but he continued to seek power with an obsession, and eventually started to devise a plan to overthrow Avalon. Once the fairy king revealed his son would be a human boy, Púca used this to create unease within the kingdom, building an army that he would lead to bring the kingdom to its downfall. He had hoped to acquire Lukaon's immense power for himself, but having his spirit hidden and bodyguarded by Morgana's magic, his only remaining option was to create a seal on the body with the elemental cores that would prevent Lukaon from ever recovering it. And once he finally does obtain Lukaon's power, he immediately thinks of taking his plans for conquest outside Avalon, only to have his life snuffed out by a single crushing blow from Morgana, who had been waiting for the moment patiently. The word Púca is the Irish word for spirit or ghost. They are also creatures from Celtic, English, and Channel Islands folklore that can bring both good and bad fortune. The stories about them are varied. However, overall, they are seen as mischievous creatures who have the ability to change shape into different animals with jet black fur. When in human form, they would still maintain some animal characteristics. The good it does can be helping farmers with crops or saving people from terrible accidents. The bad far outweighs it though, ranging from bestowing bad luck and mischief to doom and hunting people to kill them. The good and bad range of the depiction of Púcas may reflect in how Púca was a comic relief boss and not a real threat to us given what came next. Long live Púca. The true heir to the throne. Prince Lukaon is one of the fairies of the Avalon Forest since he is a half-fairy, half-human being. He first appears in Cereza's dreams, and at some point she has a dream with a new ending, and she was told to go into the Avalon Forest and follow a white wolf to be given the power to save her mother. Later, he appears as the mysterious white wolf who guides Cereza and Cheshire through the forest to find the elemental cores that bind him. Just for a small recap on the history of the Avalon Forest and the fairies. The fairies used to be ruled by King Mulciber, the first fairy king of Avalon. King Mulciber was overthrown by King Arthur since he disagreed with the traditional views of the fairies and wanted to live in a world that would have fairies and humans live in harmony. He took on a human wife, an Umbra witch named Morgana, and together they had a son named Lukaon, who was to serve as a symbol of unity between humans and fairies. One day, there was an insurgence led by Púca to overthrow King Arthur and return to how things used to be. And it was successful. Arthur was killed and Lukaon was to be cursed, but his mother Morgana was able to save him by transferring his spirit into a wolf, while his body was frozen, trapped in a crystal by the other fairies using a spell. The only way to save him was to sacrifice a demon born under the full moon of a bisextile night. Morgana had sent many young witches in training into the forest to meet their demise in hopes of saving her son, as evident by the girls trapped in crystals who provide moon pearls. Then the events of the game take place, and here we are. The name Lukaon may be a combination of Luka and Leikeon. Luka being our lovable yet clumsy fool, and Leikeon coming from the king of Arcadia from Greek mythology. King Leikeon killed and cooked his son and served him to Zeus to test his all-knowing power to see if he could tell if he was being served human flesh. To punish him, Zeus transformed Leikeon into a wolf and killed his offspring. His son, however, was brought back to life. If this sounds familiar, I did reference a different myth in a previous video who did the same thing, Tantalus, the king of Phrygia. Lukaon could also be a reference to Oberon. Oberon first appeared in the early 13th century's chanson de geste called
Les prouesses et faillites du noble Huon de Bordeaux.
I really couldn't do it, I'm sorry. In the epic poem, he's described as a fairy dwarf and the child of Julius Caesar and a fairy of Arthurian legend named Morgan Le Fay. And that should cover all the enemy fairies of the Avalon Forest. Despite looking similar to each other, I felt like these were much more creative and better named than the homunculi from Bayonetta 3. They even added a great new demon. The Thorned Pestilence. Lex Talionis is a giant spider demon with high heel shoes. She is Morgana's contracted infernal demon. Morgana views her as just a tool, and based on how Lex and Morgana fuse together well, it shows that Lex doesn't really care about being just a tool. She is more than happy to destroy to quench her thirst for rage. Her description goes: Morgana's infernal demon, a spider covered in thorns. After losing both husband and son in Púca's plan to usurp the throne, Morgana herself was exiled from Avalon. It was then she made a pact with Lex Talionis, swearing she would one day have her revenge. Each of its nimble legs are able to stab with astounding speed and strength. Every thorn on her body produces a nerve-rotting poison capable of immobilizing even the largest of beasts with a single drop. In Inferno, Lex makes her web in the blood-red river Styx, where she does nothing but trap and devour prey, unable to ever extinguish her uncontrollable rage. Her insatiable hunger and thirst only torture and anger her further. She cannot be communicated with by normal means, but she is able to reveal her inner thoughts to those she sympathizes with. Understanding Morgana through her lust for revenge towards Púca, she decided to form a pact with her. Morgana thinks of Lex as nothing more than a mere tool for her revenge, but she does understand the extremes of Lex's strength and values her because of this. Her favorite tactic is to create a giant illusion of herself to distract her opponent while Lex rips away at its target. As of yet, none have been able to overcome it. As I've mentioned before in the past, I love insect and arachnid-based demons, so seeing Lex Talionis was such a good time. The name Lex Talionis means the law of exact retaliation in Latin. In other words, this means an eye for an eye. For example, if you injure someone, you will be injured the same way. This is very in line with Morgana, who once lived peacefully among the fairies until they killed her husband and cursed her son, but she efficiently and quickly wiped out Púca in exchange for what he did once she had the chance. While similar in appearance to Phantasmarinae, she is more slender in her main body and her eye positions are different. She looks like the demon masquerade form of Bayonetta and Phantasmarinae, just without her torso and head. Speaking of which, together Morgana and Lex form the Forger of the Forbidden Covenant, Demon Masquerada, which is just Demon Masquerade. Because Morgana and Lex are so in tune with what they feel, that being pure vengeance and hatred, it enables their fusion to be extremely powerful. This was such a fantastic way to end the game, truly our most compelling villain because of how tragic she is. To summon Lex Talionis, Morgana says, "Afalore!" which means descend and bind, and to become the Demon Masquerada form, she says, "Tebetaloka!" which means sorrowful death. Well, that's all for this video. I'm sure you all have your own fun facts and thoughts, so I'm really excited to read them all. I apologize for any butchering of language I did here. I do try to learn, but sometimes the syllables just don't come out right. It's been a busy few months, and I have some stuff planned to do. I was working alongside this, so it's probably why it took so long for this to come out. I will see you all next time for the special video I have planned that is something I wanted to do for a while, so I hope you enjoy that whenever it comes out. Bye everyone, see you next time, the end.